welcome everybody again to our presentations of vaccines, regulations, and misinformation. Oh my. It has officially been a year since we began this pandemic, and a lot has happened in that past year. We've started with shutdowns of businesses, our entertainment shut down. We're unable to see family and friends the way we used to, so we lost that connection with people. Our schools have shut down. Everything is starting to reopen right now. The list goes on. And we have engaged in numerous policies and procedures and to adjust to the pandemic. And we appreciate your attendance at our prior seminars about, trying to get people back to work and applying all of the new rules that come along seemingly daily. So we have had to adjust to a new way of life over the past year. And now we're trying to adjust back. And hopefully that will go smoothly. And so I guess the measures that we started out with, masking, social distancing, sanitizing, some of those are still going to stick around. But what we have today, what we're going to talk about today, is a little bit of hope with this vaccine. Now, all of the pandemic, whether it was social distancing and masking to vaccines, have come with controversy. And that is, no business is free from that or free from the effects of that. So today, what we're going to talk about is all of the different, let's see if I can advance. Oh, spacebar. Okay, perfect.
Oh, we did too.
I did too. Okay, sorry about that. So we're gonna talk about various different current issues facing all of your businesses: the creation of vaccine policies, what the right way or the recommended way to do those. We're going to talk about continuing mask regulations. We know that some states have eliminated their mask regulations as early as yesterday. Kentucky is not one of them. How we handle the issues that pop up when people are vaccinated, questions that people have about whether they have to continue some of these rules. We're going to talk about different ways to address vaccine misinformation and continued safety measures for our employees. So that is what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to start off with a general overview of vaccine guidance. Yesterday, President Biden said that that the United States should have at least enough vaccines available by the end of May to cover every single American. And that is absolutely wonderful news. It's wonderful news because then we can get back to normal. Vaccines are the only way for us to get back to a pre-pandemic way of life. And that's something that's very interesting to all of us. Now, it's tempting for employers to require their employees to get the vaccine so that, again, we can be back in office and to have a more productive workplace. And again, just have that pre-pandemic way of life. So the question comes down to not whether can you require the vaccines, but should you? Because the EOC has already come out and said, and we know just in general terms, that the law does allow for businesses to require vaccines that have a tie to a business need. And the COVID pandemic has created that business need. We've had multiple guidances issued from the EOC claiming that the pandemic is a direct threat and that we can take the steps that we have taken, which may otherwise not have been allowable, but because of the unique situation of the pandemic. One of those were our on-site health screenings. Before that, it would have been very questionable whether an employer can ask for your temperature or the symptoms you're having on a daily basis. But that has been, through the EOC guidance, an acceptable inquiry for employees. So the fact of the matter is that we have the availability to require our employees to get vaccines, but ultimately it comes down to whether it's advisable. There is a lot to consider when we talk about whether it's advisable. The nature of your business, how close your employees are in the office. Are you public facing? Do you deal with a vulnerable population? Every business is going to have a unique inquiry to determine whether they should adopt a mandatory policy or they should adopt what we've been calling a strongly encouraged policy. So what are the pros and cons of them? And some of these are overlapping, as you might understand. But we start off with, on the pro side, vaccines provide a safe work environment. We will talk later about dealing with issues about questioning of the safety and efficacy of vaccines. But for purposes of this conversation now, it will get us to a point where we're not feeling like we can possibly spread the disease and harm our coworkers or our clients or our customers. Limiting the spread of the disease certainly limits workers' comp type issues, OSHA issues, and other workplace liability issues. We provide a safer place for the public, for our clients, our vendors, any third party that comes in. We've all dealt with endless amounts of requests to stay home or be quarantined, so absences will be reduced if our employees are vaccinated. And finally, employee morale, to feel that you can come in and be encouraged that it's a safer workplace. That employee morale also appears on the con side, because if we're requiring vaccines, you'll have some people say, you can't make me. I have rights. I don't have to take this vaccine and you can't make me. And that, of course, causes a lot of controversy and debate. Other cons could be that there is a retention to hiring. If someone knows that they have to have the vaccine to come work for you and they don't want to take the vaccine, they might not apply at your business. We've got complications with laws. So the only viable alternative, or the only viable objections to getting a mandatory vaccine, is that you have a medical or disability related condition, or you have a sincerely held religious belief. And Claire's going to talk about some of that a little bit later. But whatever policy you choose, whether it is a mandatory policy or a strongly encouraged policy, what we need for you to start with is creating a policy in writing, communicating with your employees all of the pros and cons, giving them credible access to information that they can review, and encourage them to speak with their own health provider, and put that out there and have an open door for people to talk about it. So let's now talk about some of the concerns that we have related to the ADA. Now, some of you might have businesses where you might be lucky enough to host an on-site vaccination. And if you do, these are some of the things that you need to keep up with. One of the things that we want to start off with is employees. If you are going to consider a mandatory policy, employees think they know the law. They think they know their rights, and they throw out buzzwords. They throw out buzzwords like, this is a medical examination and you don't have a business necessity, or, buzzwords that appear as though that they know what they're talking about. And the fact of the matter is, 9 times out of 10, they don't. So make sure that you're communicating with your employees about their rights and responsibilities, and what your rights and responsibilities are as well. So some of the considerations that we need to consider for if you're doing an on-site, which I know is rare, but if you're able to do an on-site vaccine, you want to be careful about the information you are requesting from your employees, that we limit it to the information that's necessary to get the vaccine, and that we're not going into more disability related questions, information that you might not want to know, information that you might not be entitled to know. On-site vaccines also, you might have pre-screening questions, and those pre-screening questions might elicit information that would indicate someone has a medical issue or disability that you didn't already know. You would want to tender those questions to be very specific and narrow to just the vaccine. At the same time, the questionnaire might discourage people from wanting to get the vaccine. So we've got to be careful about the information we're seeking if we're doing mandatory vaccine policy that happens to be on site. And if you are doing a mandatory vaccine policy that's not on site, we also are going to be really careful about the information we're asking from our employees about getting the vaccine. And that's whether it's a disability related inquiry or a religious inquiry. We do not want to be asking our employees questions that cross the line into those types of considerations. And in the same regard, we want to watch water cooler talk. We want to make sure that we're not having conversations, side conversations, supervisors talking to the employees that they supervise. Well, why didn't you get the vaccine? Or why aren't you getting the vaccine? And that's true for mandatory or voluntary programs. That conversation should not be had because it will elicit information that you either do not want to know or should not know. But to comply with the ADA, you can ask questions that are job related, consistent with a business necessity. Claire is going to talk about the direct threat component to this, but all of the guidance we're receiving from the EOC is we're confident that mandatory vaccines, if you choose to do so, and the pre-screening questions that come along with them with respect to the pandemic only will qualify under all of the ADA considerations. And again, we're just going to be careful about the questions that we ask and the information that we're eliciting. So let's talk about really what most employers will do is more of a voluntary vaccination program, or even, let's go back a second, a mandatory vaccination program that doesn't happen on site where you're not giving the pre-screening questions. You still want to limit the amount of information you're requesting from your employees. But a voluntary vaccination program should be truly voluntary at every step. So any questions that you're asking of your employees should be voluntary on their part to answer. And we want to, again, limit those to only vaccine-related inquiries, not to elicit information about other potential disabilities. We're not going to ask people why they're not getting it. I said that before, I'll say it again, I'll probably repeat it another time. Refrain from that. And I'll give you a real life example. We received an inquiry from a potential client who was asking about how he had felt retaliated against because he chose not to get the vaccine. And after he chose not to get it, people started asking him questions about why he didn't get it. And it ultimately resulted in feeling like he was not receiving assignments, that he was getting the cold shoulder, that he felt that there was some retaliation. Now, we're going to talk about what to do when an employee refuses a vaccine and, whether you can take action or even terminate them. But aside from that, you still have that morale issue that people are going to feel targeted if there's that conversation about why they didn't get the vaccine. Why aren't you getting it? Are you crazy? Any of that type of information questions, whether it comes from coworkers or supervisors, should be discouraged. It's going to be a personal choice and something that we need to respect our employees. You as an employer, we're going to discuss your options if people refuse, and they're perfectly legitimate options. We have this in mind as we're going through our decision to create a policy, whether it's mandatory or voluntary. Third-party vaccination distribution. So again, we want to be careful about the information that we're seeking. Follow-up questions that we ask our employees are going to be also want to be careful about. I've gotten a lot of questions about, well, I want to know if we have a voluntary program, I want to know how many employees I have that have received the vaccine because I want to know again how protected we are in sort of a mini herd immunity inquiry. You can absolutely ask for proof of the vaccine. I have received my first dose, and with it I got a card that said the date of the vaccine and I think the type, whether it was Moderna or Pfizer. And that card produces no medical information. And so you can ask for proof by asking for a copy of the card. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not a medical inquiry. It's not a medical examination. Any of those buzzwords your employees try to use will not be effective because that proof is not a medical inquiry. Now, if you go beyond that and ask for medical records or something further, then you might be crossing an ADA line. But I would encourage you to have a mechanism for proof because it'll give you some level of comfort in your own environment about the level of immunity you might have within your organization. And it might also make you feel more comfortable if you've only got a handful of people who are refusing, it might make you feel more comfortable with what jobs you might assign to them as a result of their refusal. So before I switch it over to Claire, I do want to take a moment to remind you of GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. It was enacted in 2008 or 2009, and it prohibits employers from having or receiving family medical information. as an overview. So that means that if my mom had breast cancer, you can't find out about it. So before we go into the vaccines, I'm going to put a little bit of homework on your plate and ask you to review any forms that you're using to for return to work inquiries from physicians, that you should not be asking on any portion of those forms for information related to family medical history, because it would violate this act. And we can talk for a whole seminar on GINA, but for the purposes of this, the question has arisen whether the vaccine or a vaccine program would implicate GINA. And the EOC's guidance has stated that a vaccine program does not implicate GINA so long as you're not asking for family medical history, which you should not be doing anyway. So that, and it doesn't implicate it if we require proof of the family medical or proof of the vaccine as well. So that's something that we should be, one, always be reminded of laws that don't come up that often, but we can still be liable if we violate them, and how they implicate these new programs that we have. So again, if you're doing pre-vaccine questionnaires, make sure that you're not asking family medical history, and keep those questions narrowly tailored. So with that, I am going to switch over to Claire. You'll have to excuse our transition because I need to get out of the camera.
We're going to do a little SNL.
Not exactly sure. There you go.
That was your entertainment for this.
Oh, and they get it 3 more times.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
you get it multiple times. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is Title VII considerations. So employees are protected under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. They can refuse vaccination under protected identity. So for instance, it's a sincerely held religious belief. I always trip over that. Or pregnancy. So pregnancy is kind of the easier of the two. It's basically because we don't have certainty as to the effect on the unborn child, so they can refuse based on that. The more difficult one relates to religious belief. So once an employer receives notice that an employee's sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance prevents him or her from taking the COVID vaccine, there's some things that you have to do. The employer has to provide a reasonable accommodation, just like with ADA, except for the standard is a little bit different, unless there's an undue hardship. So the undue hardship for Title VII is more than a de minimis cost on the operation of the employer's business, which is lower than the standard for ADA. And so under ADA, the undue hardship is defined as a significant difficulty or expense. But you'd still have the responsibility to engage in the interactive process. Excuse my reach. Okay. So the guidance that just issued from the EEOC suggests that mandatory vaccination programs are lawful, subject to our reasonable accommodations, like Cindy said, in terms of the ADA and some other issues. That's true for Title VII too. However, you got to be prepared for the religious exemption objection. So let's deal with that first. What is a sincerely held religious belief? And just as an aside, the EEOC just issued a huge training on religious accommodation for its employees, and published basically guidance on what that means and how to have an accommodation and what discrimination looks like, what harassment looks like. It's worth jumping on the site and checking it out if you're at all interested. Okay, but anyway, so sincerely held religious belief, the sincerely held portion is almost never at issue. What is at issue generally is the religious belief. So Title VII defines religion to include all aspects of religious observance and practice. So not just practices that we think of in terms of standard religion, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, but also any obscure, sorry about that. What you're looking for in terms of religious belief is kind of an ultimate idea of life, death, and purpose. That's what the EEOC says. So to help figure out what that is, social, political, or economic philosophies, not a religious belief. Personal beliefs like I'm a vegan or ethical objections, I don't believe in vaccines, are generally insufficient to support this exemption. But, and personal preferences don't apply. However, if you're vegetarian because you're a Seventh-day Adventist, then, we got to talk about it. So, let me jump. Okay. So if you need, if you have, you've been presented with a sincerely held religious belief, the employer should follow the interactive process. And a lot of you guys are used to this. You've already done it with ADA. So it looks pretty much the same. In terms of religious accommodation, you have to obtain whatever information is needed to determine whether the reasonable accommodation is necessary without posing an undue hardship. So this typically involves a conversation where you discuss what the primary issue is, what religious accommodations could satisfy. You want to really be flexible here. If the accommodation isn't immediately apparent, discuss the request with the employee. And you're allowed to ask for additional information, and the employee should provide it. So one of the things that you can do is you can ask a religious leader. It doesn't have to be a religious leader. It could be anybody in the sect or group that practices. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to substantiate an objective basis for that religious belief. Okay. Examples of a accommodation is a case-by-case analysis. So it could be transferring a person, it could be adjusting work hours, it could be allowing remote work, it could be allowing PPE in common areas or a temporary reassignment. As I said, for Title VII, employers do not need to make an accommodation if doing so would present an undue hardship, which is defined as more than a de minimis cost. So the payment of administrative costs for the accommodation, like rearranging a schedule, for payroll purposes, infrequent or temporary payment of overtime wages, that is a de minimis cost. However, hiring a new employee to cover your shift permanently, that is more than enough. So this is really a case-by-case evaluation. By now, you're going to want to call your attorney and have help making these evaluations. So here's, and if the religious accommodation poses a safety risk, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but if it poses a safety risk, that is more than a de minimis cost. So an example provided by the EEOC, Patricia alleges she was terminated for her job at the mill because of her religion. She's Pentecostal. She notified her supervisor that her faith prohibits her from wearing pants as required by the mill's dress code, and requested an accommodation to wear a skirt. Management contends that the dress code is essential to safety and efficient operation, and dresses or skirts cause accidents. Because the evidence establishes that wearing pants is truly necessary, the EEOC said in this example, the accommodation requested by Patricia does in fact pose an undue hardship. Okay, so if an employee refuses a vaccine due to a disability under ADA or sincerely held religious belief or other medical reason under Title VII, and an accommodation can't be found, then what? Okay, so under the ADA, an employer can require an employee with a disability to be vaccinated if the employee would pose a direct threat to health and safety of individuals in the workplace if he or she didn't get the vaccine. So, and note, I know Cindy said this before, but it begs repeating. If an employer chooses to administer the vaccine on site, it will be required to ask questions that elicit information regarding a disability. In order to do so legally, the employee must be able to show that the pre-vaccination questions are job-related and consistent with business necessity. Again, to do so, the employer could show the unvaccinated person would likely pose a direct threat to others in the workplace, such that screening would be job-related and consistent with business necessity. Okay, so what is a direct threat? Under the ADA regulations, a qualification standard that screens out or tends to screen out an individual with a disability or a class of individuals with disabilities is unlawful unless it's job-related or consistent with business necessity. So that's where you get into the direct threat analysis. An employer can meet this standard by showing that the unvaccinated person imposes a direct threat, and the EEOC has blessed that in terms of vaccinations if you show that they are a direct threat. This assessment is individualized. It is not a one-size-fits-all. You have to assess the individual's ability to perform the essential functions of his or her job safely without getting the vaccine. And that assessment is based on a reasonable medical judgment that relies on current medical knowledge and/or the best available objective evidence. So, what does this individualized assessment look like? The employer has to consider the duration of the risk posed by the employee, the nature and severity of the potential harm caused by the employee, the likelihood that the potential harm will occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. So again, in most cases, you're going to find that with the vaccine, if they're interacting with a large group of people, if they could, take down your business. Okay. So as I said, the EEOC's guidance states that the pandemic meets the direct threat threshold based on the CDC. You still have to provide the individual, you still have to do the individual assessment. This means that a significant risk of substantial harm is posed by somebody with COVID that's present in the workplace. Now, I say this, the EEOC could change their guidance. Once more people get vaccinated, once herd immunity comes around, this could change. If there is a direct threat that can't be reduced to the acceptable level, the employer can exclude the employee from physically entering the workplace. But this doesn't mean that the employer can automatically terminate the worker. And that's what Cindy's going to talk about. So I'm going to do the slide. Hopefully, I just have to slide backwards.
You have to slide backwards. Okay, so where are we? Where are we now? The good news is that employers have a lot of leeway with regard to vaccines, voluntary programs, or requiring. The only justifiable reason, as Claire said, for refusing a vaccine is that you have a disability or medical condition that would prevent you from getting the vaccine, or you have a sincerely held religious belief. Personal beliefs, whether you believe that the vaccine is not safe, you believe that it's just not for you, or you're an anti-vaxxer, or you are fearful of it in some way, none of that is going to be allowed as a reason to refuse the vaccine. So the good news is you can have this conversation with your employees, and you can stand firm if you're going to require the vaccine that the only legally authorized refusal or objection is based upon religion or medical inquiry. So, but what about people? So what happens when people refuse? And you want to keep in mind what I said at the beginning is employee morale. How do you deal with that? So I would suggest that if you have people who are refusing for reasons unrelated to a disability, unrelated to their religious beliefs that must be accommodated, or at least attempt to be accommodated, that we consider using those same accommodations for people who refuse to get a vaccine, even if it's on a voluntary basis, right? So if you want your employees in order as a condition of returning to the office, as a condition of working in a public-facing position to have a vaccine, they can choose not to get the vaccine. They're just not going to have that position. So those accommodations that Claire mentioned, whether it was, requiring work from home, requiring continued use of PPE, even when the requirements are gone by our governor, you can use those accommodations to restrict the positions or the jobs that those who refuse to get the vaccine can have. And that is true whether it's a mandatory policy or a voluntary policy. You can use the vaccine as a condition to returning to certain jobs. But the most important aspect of all of this is clear communication. Start now. Start now with explaining what conditions there will be to returning to work. What happens if you refuse a vaccine? What happens if you get a vaccine? We've seen places like Kroger and Starbucks offering incentives to get a vaccine, incentives like a $100 gift card or something along those lines. So you have to communicate, and we're going to talk about those communications at the end of this, but that should be starting now. So we like to put in a couple of real life examples of how vaccine programs have worked, because this is not the first or only vaccine that certain employers will require for their employees. So in the health industry, many vaccines are required in order to work with patients. In this particular case in 2018, this independent living skills specialist refused a vaccine, or she wasn't immunized for measles, mumps, rubella. She didn't have the MMR vaccine. And she had claimed that she had an allergy, and so she refused to take the vaccination. So she was terminated. And the health system had a reasonable job-related, consistent with the business necessity reason that because she was going to be interfacing with patients, she had to be immunized. But she claimed that there was a violation of the ADA because of the termination. And her claim was dismissed by the court because, one, the employer had a job, it was consistent with the job and a business necessity for her to have that vaccination. And she actually presented no evidence that she had any allergic reactions or chemical sensitivities, and therefore did not actually have a disability. So to Claire's point, the information that you can request from your employees about ADA reasons or religious reasons, which we'll talk about in a second, your employee has to produce it. They can't just say, hey, I've got an allergic reaction, I can't take this vaccine. That's not going to be sufficient, as you know. And there are cases with regard to other vaccines in industries where it certainly is a business necessity that can and will be used in regard to the pandemic and the employee's refusal. This case is a case regarding a religious exemption, and it illustrates some of the things that Claire was talking about. She gave great guidance on what is a religion, what isn't a religion. It is a very broad definition. And like she said, the sincerely held part isn't going to be in question. It's what is the religious belief. So you can ask how the religious belief would prevent the individual from getting a vaccine. And certainly that could be a form that you create in order to determine whether you're going to provide the accommodation. But in this particular case, the individual claimed that the vaccine itself, because it was, the vaccine itself had a pork byproduct in it, and she was a vegan, or the use of ingestion of pork was against her religion, that she wasn't going to take the vaccine. And that is a sincerely held religious belief. And that is something that we should look at accommodating. So the hospital said, well, we've got other vaccines available, other storage solutions. Forgive me for my lack of medical knowledge, but vaccines are stored in non-gelatin, non-pork related products, and we're going to let you have that vaccine. And once that happened, the employee said, well, now I've got a bad reaction, and so I'm not going to take it at all, regardless of whether there's pork in the vaccine solution at all. And because of that, she claimed that she was discriminated against. The court looked at it because, one, the medical history didn't show any of the allergic reactions, but more importantly, the employer offered an accommodation for her religious belief for a vaccine that was not stored with a pork solution. And that was and should have been sufficient. So you also have to remember with these accommodations that offering a reasonable accommodation, if it's refused by the employee, you're protected. The employee doesn't necessarily get the accommodation they want, as long as the accommodation you're offering is reasonable. And in this instance, the employer offered up a perfectly reasonable alternative to the pork-based vaccine, and she refused, claiming some other ground. So she wasn't protected. So it's a really important illustration of how, what information you need to get, and that a reminder that the employee doesn't get the exact accommodation they're asking for so long as what you're offering is reasonable. So as a takeaway from the two case examples, again, the only legal grounds to refuse is a disability or medical condition and a religious belief. And then the accommodation that's provided has to meet the guidance that Claire talked about, which I won't repeat. But again, the accommodation just has to be reasonable. You certainly can require a vaccine. And if not, you can, or if they refuse, then you can offer different job solutions, especially if it is unrelated to the ADA or Title VII. If it's just a personal belief or fear, then you can decide that this person has a different job in your organization. And again, documentation can be requested and required of the employee so that you can do your due diligence in trying to figure out whether you need to provide the accommodation and what accommodation needs to be provided. Back to Claire.
Love this. It makes me laugh every time. Okay.
So far, so good.
So far, so good. Okay, so best practices for creating a vaccine policy. And we do actually, I highly recommend, and I know Cindy does, that you have a vaccine policy. We're already getting religious exemption requests. And so we've put out a couple of forms, and those are things that you need to have at the ready because you need to be prepared when you get those requests for exemptions. Okay, so what do you think, what does this look like? What does a vaccine policy look like to be legally compliant? Okay, so first of all, your policy should explain the purpose and the benefits of vaccination. As Cindy said, communication is key. Lay the groundwork, explain why it's important, explain how it preserves your business, explain how it preserves their jobs. Do you want a mandatory or non-mandatory vaccination policy? Think about that, figure out the pros and cons that we discussed, weigh and balance what your business needs. What is the scope and coverage of your vaccination policy? Is it consistent across all workplaces? Or are the office employees required to receive a vaccine, but it's voluntary for those who are out in the field and aren't exposed to as many people? Does the policy include exemptions for medical reasons, disability, religious exemptions, as we have been saying this whole hour? Yes, of course it has to. And as Cindy said, again, if your policy is mandatory, you need to figure out how you're going to validate it or validate that your employees received a vaccination. As Cindy said, asking for that card is perfectly legal. Have you trained your HR and supervisors what is a permissible question and what is not a permissible question? Because again, as we've discussed, the answer to that question is going to vary by employer. And so you want to make sure that your supervisors aren't just jumping on the web and trying to figure out themselves what is permissible and what is not permissible. You really have to make a reasoned decision. Is it mandatory? Is it non-mandatory? Is there a direct threat? Is there not a direct threat? I would recommend that you include a confidentiality clause in your vaccine policy to give everybody assurances that they will not be asked about their medical information. They will not be asked about whether, they refused for personal reasons. They will, make sure that this information doesn't get out at the water cooler, whether or not they've had a vaccine. And what is your procedure for handling folks who refuse to get a vaccine? You want to put that in your policy, and you want to train your supervisors about that policy. Describe the consequences of noncompliance, so there's no question. All of that should be in your vaccine policy. Oh, and if it is voluntary, the incentives actually really work. My husband runs a business, and he said, there were a lot of folks who refused to get vaccines when it first was presented. And he said things like having pizza parties and T-shirt giveaways and raffles worked wonders for getting folks on board. So I know it sounds like a minimal thing, but sometimes, just making it a little less scary helps a lot. Okay. Cool issue, cool fact that I put on my notes that I forgot to say. If you've already had COVID, you might get this question, do I still need to get a vaccine? The CDC says yes, largely because we don't know how long folks will be protected or how strong that protection will be. Okay, so the next slide, the CDC substantially relaxed its recommendations for those who have received a full vaccine. So this is another incentive to get it. You won't miss work if you're exposed to somebody who has COVID. So an individual exposed to somebody suspected of COVID and is not required to quarantine if they've been fully vaccinated and it's been at least 2 weeks, are within 3 months of vaccination, and have remained asymptomatic. And the CDC also relaxed the requirements, by the way, for folks who have had COVID-19, how long they have to quarantine. Now it's only 10 days since the symptoms first appeared and 24 hours with no fever and other symptoms of COVID are improving. So if you can reach all those qualifications, your quarantine is only 10 days. Okay. Mask regulation overview. As most of you know, in Kentucky, masks are still required in public places and workplaces. This excludes kids that are 5 or younger. Federally, they have stated that all passengers on public transportation, included buses, trains, subways, etc., must wear a mask. And in all federally owned businesses, buildings or lands, a mask is required still. Okay. If I own a private company, do they have to comply? Yes. So even if you are a private company, you still have to have a mask mandate. Businesses have to ensure that employees wear face masks for any interactions between coworkers while in common areas. And in addition to satisfying the legal requirement, masks make workers feel more comfortable. There's still a lot of fear of getting COVID-19, depending on where you are and what your geographic, how high the rates are in your geographic area. Instituting and enforcing a mask mandate, which, by the way, I recognize Cindy and I are not doing right now. We always get comments about this, but we have actually been vaccinated. Instituting a mask mandate makes people feel comfortable, which leads me to the next slide. I got my vaccine. Do I still have to wear a mask? Despite what Cindy and I are doing, the answer is yes, you still have to wear a mask. It's unclear whether or not we can transmit it to other folks once we've been vaccinated, whether we're essentially carriers. It's too new. These vaccinations are too new. It's difficult to predict. So your policy should include a statement that even if you have been vaccinated, you are still required to wear a mask and, social distance. Okay, 1 mask versus 2. Experts are increasingly recommending that you use 2 masks, especially in places where it's difficult to social distance. My daughter plays volleyball. We're in a gymnasium. Everybody's crunched in. I wear 2 masks just to be safe. So while it's not part of the mask mandate, employers should consider whether or not this is a good idea if people are packed in and it's very difficult to social distance. Okay, so what is the future? Our guess is that we're going to have some mask requirements for quite a long time. It might be that you're going to have a mask mandate when you feel ill, but I don't think anybody feels comfortable at this point with the weird variants that we're getting throughout the world. And so our guess is that there will always be a mask mandate until we can figure this out, until we can make sure the vaccine works for the variants. There are statewide requirements that are being challenged, including in Kentucky. And as everybody knows, Texas just removed their mask mandate. I suspect that there will be, an increase in COVID, and that will probably swing the pendulum back. Okay, so best practices for mask policies. We're gonna have 2 slides about this, but I don't know how good we are on time. I'm sorry?
1147.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to kind of jump through these. I have found, by the way, that mask campaigns and policies that are funny or eye-catching really are the best ways of handling it. Tennessee Department of Health has some really fun examples for, don't wear your mask on your head, don't wear it on your neck. And they use cartoons that are ridiculous and a little bit unorthodox. And those, I think, are really effective. If you could have your marketing guy, create a couple of those, that would be great. Masks should be 2 layers. You should have a wire to prevent it. They shouldn't wear it on their head. They shouldn't wear it on their neck. The gaiters aren't particularly effective, so I wouldn't wear that. And I'm going to let you guys kind of look at these slides. We will provide these slides, so you'll have access to them. And now I'm going to turn it over to Cindy and do the little swishy swoop. Yeah.
So the reason why we're still talking about masks is the governors in Kentucky, we still have a mask mandate. So when it comes down to whether you're vaccinated, whether you're not vaccinated, wearing a mask is still required in Kentucky. And it is to get us to the point where we're back to normal, back to our pre-pandemic way of life. And in that regard, before we get into vaccine misinformation, I want to also sort of put out there that once we do have a relaxation of our mask mandate, businesses can still require masks if you would like to, even if the governor says no. That's certainly well within your purview. And if you don't require them at that point, if you have employees that want to wear them, let's make sure that we're not masking individuals who feel that they still need to wear it, because it's their personal choice. And we've got to tone down any of that rhetoric if it does happen. But with all of this and everything we've dealt with in the last year, there's been a ton of misinformation and a ton of conspiracy theories. We can all probably recite some of the craziest ones that we have heard. And what it comes down to is we have to deal with it. And so I know we've got some questions, so I want to just go over this pretty quickly. We want to, as employers, provide credible information in any communication we have about a vaccine policy. It should contain statements from the CDC, references to their guidance, and encourage our employees to go to their own physician for their medical advice. We want to encourage people to get the vaccines and lead by example as well. The misinformation is something that we are all dealing with in terms of trying to, whether it's our family members, our coworkers, or our bosses. And this website, it's at vaccinemisinformation.guide. It's a great resource for combating that within your workplace. We have had clients that have reached out to us to try to figure out how they can engage in a campaign to stop this dissemination of misinformation about COVID and the vaccine. And from your perspective, you need to be prepared to understand what the issues are. Listen, as we always do to our employees, listen and let them vent and tell us what their reasoning is, try to understand where they're coming from, and engage them in this process to try to diffuse the notions that contain misinformation. And the best way to do that is to not tell them what you believe, but provide that credible information from the CDC, get from their own physicians and other credible resources, because that is going to be, part of the issue that you'll deal with in the workplace. So just to summarize, before we get to your questions, it's important now to review your existing policies, make sure they're up to date and that they are in compliance with what you're going to be doing with regard to vaccines. Create a clear vaccine policy, as Claire and I have said throughout this morning. Make sure that your employees know that until the governor decides or you as a business decide that a mask mandate is not going to be required, that they're still going to have to wear masks and we're still going to deal with all the PPE and other precautions. Allow remote work when possible, but if it's not possible or if it's something that you've decided we're going to eliminate, clearly communicate that. And finally, until otherwise known, we have to continue all of the social distancing and other issues. So with that, that's sort of a summary of what we talked about. I think Brian has a few questions for us. Yeah. Okay, here's the second one. Go for it.
Okay, so the first question is, can we prohibit an employee who declines the COVID-19 vaccination from coming into the office and working remotely? That's a perfectly appropriate accommodation. If they can perform their duties from home satisfactorily, that is an absolutely appropriate accommodation to make for a religious belief or an ADA accommodation.
And honestly, if you have a mandatory policy or, you have another business reason for someone who refuses for a non-religious or non-medical reason, you can make that accommodation as a condition of employment as well. So, okay, the second question. There were guidelines on incentives regarding the vaccine by the prior federal administration. The current administration voided these guidelines on January 21st and did not replace them with anything. Any consideration on incentives? We still believe incentives are perfectly appropriate. I have not seen what you're referencing here just because I haven't kept up with that, but I think they're perfectly appropriate and sometimes can really bridge that gap.
Yeah, I agree. And I've seen it used. I mean, there was some question as to whether or not it was discriminatory. In other words, that you're giving some people incentives and other people are not based on their disability. But most of these incentives are relatively de minimis. I mean, $100 gift certificate or a T-shirt or a pizza party. And I think that goes a long way.
Let's see. Do you have to offer another position as an accommodation? So we're going to go through the same ADA to inquiry. So if that other position, if they're qualified for the other position and it's vacant, absolutely. That would be something that you would consider as an accommodation. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I just think, again, you would just do the same accommodation that you're, analysis that you're used to. You're not required to create a new job for these folks.
Okay, why don't you read that one?
Okay. If we do not require a vaccination for employees who do not work in the office, if customers don't care, should we require something in writing from the customer and employee that they agree to that? I don't know if I understand the question.
I think that if they're not requiring a vaccination, should they get the employee or the customers to say, yeah, that's fine. I don't care if everybody's vaccinated.
Okay, so are we assuming, I guess we're assuming that the employee and the customer will engage, will be together or be exposed to each other. I mean, I think that I would still insist on PPE and making sure that you keep it socially distanced and you comply to all of the state and CDC mandates. And then I don't necessarily think it's required that you get a sign off. If it makes you feel more comfortable, then I think that's fine. But I don't think it's required.
Yeah, and I don't know that I necessarily would. I mean, because I don't know really that it does any good. We've had seminars before on employer liability, and I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of liability attached there. And so, having everybody sign off, I don't know that would be necessary, but I think you could certainly require the continued use of PPE.
Yeah.
All right. What if you give an incentive to the employee for receiving the vaccine and there are side effects to the vaccine later? Can an employee sue you for giving them an incentive? No. So, if it's a voluntary program and they chose to do it and they choose to do it, even though they were incentivized or that they were, that they had some, that you gave them the incentive, they still voluntarily chose to get the vaccine. And honestly, I just don't see a line of liability there, what cause of action that might be.
Yeah. I mean, I think these issues have come up with incentives. It's interesting because I've seen a lot of articles on them, but I don't actually think that they're going to go very far.
Yeah.
So yes, are people talking about whether or not it's discriminatory? Yes. Are people talking about whether or not there's liability? Yes. But again, we're in a pandemic. And so I don't think that this is going to be something that will carry any water in court. It does pose a threat to folks. We do want to incentivize folks to get vaccinated. The government is attempting to, incentivize. The entire world is attempting to incentivize vaccinations. So, yes, people are talking about it. No, I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
All right. So this last question is: working in a private business when you cannot socially distance without a mask still legal in Kentucky, even if we've been vaccinated? So, First of all, private businesses are limited to, I think they're going up to 60% capacity. That's still a requirement. You still have a mask mandate, even if you're fully vaccinated. I actually got this inquiry from a client that they're all fully vaccinated and he wants to do away with the mask requirement in his business. And as far as we are today, the governor still requires it. So you cannot eliminate that mask mandate in your business until the governor lifts the restriction. So, I don't know what else. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, and I don't know if they're going to lift that restriction until we know whether or not, until more people get vaccinated, but also until we know whether or not people who have been vaccinated can communicate COVID.
Right.
I mean, and that's really the issue. So even if they're all vaccinated, they might be able to communicate it to your customers or your clients.
Right. So masking is still going to be required. Okay. And just to confirm, employers should refrain from asking employees if they receive the vaccine or if they plan on getting the vaccine. Go ahead.
No on the first one. You can ask them if they've gotten vaccinated. You cannot ask them, or you should not ask them, why you didn't get vaccinated if they say no.
Right.
And the whole purpose behind that is you don't want to elicit information about their disability. So let's say you say, did you get vaccinated? And they say no. The conversation should end there. You don't want, and in fact, you want to say, and I don't know, I don't care why if you say no.
Right.
Because what you don't want is for them to say, well, because I have this disability that you were unaware of that now you're aware of. Or I have this medical condition that you were previously unaware of, but now you're aware of. So that's the risk.
And so, for example, here in our office, we are not having large in-person meetings with all of our attorneys. If we know every attorney in the office is vaccinated, then we would still use masks, but we could have an in-person all attorney meeting. That would be something maybe we would want to do, but might not want to do it unless we knew that the population in the room had been fully vaccinated. So asking whether they've received the vaccine, even if you did it on an anonymous basis, you might have a ton of different business reasons for it. And that's certainly something that you can ask. But like Claire said, the follow-up should not be asked. Are there any other?
This one came in, you may have took this. This is before the presentation.
Okay, I am specifically interested in how to handle employees that choose not to be vaccinated. Once we are back in person, work full time, how should we be prepared to handle ongoing precautions that will be needed to keep these folks safe while also needing them to interact with coworkers and clients and persons more frequently? So this, I assume that this, implies that you want to keep them on staff. You don't want to have them work at home, and you don't want to transfer them. I think the best way to do it is do what you're doing now. You want to have a mask mandate. You want to have them, a 6-foot buffer around those folks. You want to keep, your sanitation stations up. You want to do all the things that you're doing now. And I mean, frankly, if you don't want to, try to find an accommodation for them and they're still going to be on site, that's all you can do. I mean, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, if they choose not to be vaccinated, you get to set the parameters and the rules. So we've talked about if you want to put them in a different position or you want to require that they wear a mask, even if no one else has to wear a mask, you can do that. We got to just think through all of these scenarios. Like Claire said at the beginning, these are going to be very fact intensive situations that it's good to talk through with your attorney about.
Well, and you had said, and our clients in person more frequently. So you assume that if they're going to interact more frequently, which is different than they would be now, then maybe you need to talk to them about what precautions they have and how they're going to protect themselves, what they're going to communicate to the customer to make sure that the customer might need to wear a mask. The customer might need to, use sanitation precautions. And if that can't happen, then maybe that's not possible and you do have to start looking for an accommodation.
And remember, if it's not necessarily about the employee's risk, because they're taking that risk themselves. It's about whether the employee can transmit that to an unvaccinated customer, client, or someone else in your office. That's what we're looking out for. If you don't want to get the vaccine, that's on you, but you're not going to the response needs to be, you're now putting other people at risk because you can transmit it. And
Right.
hopefully those of us who get vaccinated will not be able to transmit it. Is there another question?
That's what.
Okay, does an employee have to give their employer proof that they have been vaccinated? You can certainly ask for that. And again, limit it to just proof of the vaccine and no other medical information.
Right. And if it's voluntary, the question is whether, what do they do? What do you do if they refuse, right? They say, no, I'm not going to give you that. Ask, say, well, if you were vaccinated, why would you not want to give me that?
Yeah.
You can ask that question, just say, I don't want to know about your medical. I don't want to know anything about, a disability. I don't want to know any medical information. Is there a reason why you don't want to give me that card? And, then you're going to have to figure out how to deal with that. And again, that might be a call to, your attorney. But if it is mandatory, if you have a mandatory policy and they say, no, I'm not going to give you that, well, then you're going to have to figure out what to do with that employee and you're going to have to work through your mandatory policy.
Yeah. Okay, I don't think there are any other questions. We certainly, as always, appreciate your attendance and your attention to our seminars, and we hope to see you again at our next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.